Great. Well, hello. My name is Proactive Paul. I've worked as a business coach. It's my job to help small businesses make more profit in less time. And it's my job to make people more happy. And at one time, I used to be on the speaking circuit, especially with the Chamber of Commerce. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Today, I want to talk about the universal problem-solving technique. And this is about solving a jigsaw puzzle. What is the jigsaw puzzle? I'm going to talk a little bit about some component parts. I'm going to explore one part in a bit of detail, and then at the end I'm going to get into exactly how I close this off. I should point out that there is no one universal problem-solving technique. There are actually quite a lot, and this is not really one solution which you can take away and implement. This is a concept. Hi, come on in. This is a concept that you can borrow, you can modify, and I think the way to explain it to start with is think of a holiday. What is your ideal holiday? This is more like a holiday planner. It's not the holiday. So for some people, you would go on holiday and you would think, no, I want to go and spend 3 hours standing in an airport, long flight, an hour standing at passport control, and spend a week on a beach getting sand in my shoes and drinking lots of alcohol and listening to loud music. Whereas other people would go, well, I want to go and spend time in a remote cottage halfway up a Scottish mountain and spend a whole week walking up and down the pointy bits of planet Earth. So the holiday is not the same thing as the holiday planner. And whilst I've got this suggestion, it's not necessarily the one that's going to work with you. I'll show you what I've done, and we'll start with talking about the little old lady who lived in Kent. I was doing workshops and seminars, particularly in Ashford. I've done Canterbury, Chatham, and a number of places. And at one of these workshops, I was doing something called paper management, because in the old days, offices used to be full of paper. This is very early internet, where we didn't have the tools and tricks that we have now. And the little old lady who lived in Kent came up to me after one of these paper management workshops and said, I need you to come and help me with a bit of paper management, a bit of coaching. And what that meant is that I did a paper audit. So, off to her house. I should say, this is a 45-minute talk, which I've cut down to 25 minutes for the benefit of BarCamp Canterbury. So I'm going to try and rush through all the key points. I'm going to skip all the funnies, all the jokes, and all the nice anecdotes, and you're just going to get the real content. So, yes, her home was her office. I will blog this, probably tomorrow. So midnight tomorrow, Monday, you will be able to get some detail, and you'll be able to get the slides off my website. So her office was a room upstairs in her house, and it was full of paper. I went round to her house to do a paper audit, basically. Where does the paper come from? Where does it go to? And her office was a bit like this. The paper arrives at the front door. It comes through the letterbox. It lands on the doormat. And from the doormat, some of it will be picked up and put on the little bookcase in the hallway. Some of it would find its way onto the coffee table in the living room. Some of it would end up on the kitchen table. And if it looked particularly important, she would place the unopened envelope on top of the toaster. Because if it's on top of the toaster, it's not going to get overlooked. I saw the office, the in tray, the out tray, the pending tray looked a bit like these ones. And she had stacks of magazines everywhere. Underneath the desk, there were 10 stacks of magazines, a bit like this, such that you didn't need table legs. You could have balanced a tabletop on these 10 piles of magazines. The office chair wouldn't fit underneath the table. She hadn't thrown away anything in years. So the coaching session went back to the kitchen, and we sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, with no toast, and we looked at how we were going to handle paper. How do you handle paper? There is a process, and the email process can be similar. And my email process today is based on the paper management process, which I used 15, 20 years ago. So I need to tell you the story of the nutty professor. I learnt about the nutty professor when I was at university. It wasn't part of my university course. It was a chat I had with the secretary in the corridor, and she said, I work for this nutty professor who just can't control paper. Well, he can, because he's come up with a new theory. He's come up with the volcano theory of paper management. And he had dispensed with the in tray, the pending tray, and the out tray, and he'd taken all the paper that comes into his office and sits on his desk and put it into a pile in the middle of the floor. And the pile resembled a volcano. And it wasn't his job to manage it anymore. He would just take the top piece of the top of the pile, and he would work it. And then he'd take the next piece off the top of the pile. And of course, all his colleagues and fellow lecturers discovered what he was doing. So they would come into his office, they would rifle through this volcano looking for the important document and then stick it on the top. So in effect, he had delegated the filtering of his workload to all of his teammates and his secretary. And he wouldn't touch the volcano other than to take the piece of paper off the top. And then on the first day of every calendar month, he would come in and he would say to his secretary, I need some help. Come into the office, and he would then scoop up the top half of the volcano, which by volume is about 33% of the paper, and instruct her to take away the bottom bit of the volcano and shred it. And then he put that bit down on the floor and continued the same process with a smaller volcano, which his mates would come in and rearrange for him, whilst he just kept working things off the top. And he reasoned that if something was particularly important, someone would put it on the top anyway. And if he did lose something and it went in the shredder, he'd get a reminder in any case. So things still got done. Right. A point of telling you that story is there are two principles he came up with. One was never start with the backlog. Just declare backlog bankruptcy, get rid of it. And if things are really important, people will nudge you and help you along and give you an idea about what to do. Now, this material I've developed over many, many years, and whilst that looks incredibly scary, there are 10 flowcharts in my universal problem-solving technique. I'm not suggesting that yours needs 10 or anything. There are actually other ones on the web. If I go back a bit, I will find this one. This one is particularly good. It's less about problem solving and it's more about project management. But if you want to see What If 2 by XKCD, it would be quite exciting. Is there anybody here from the University of Iowa? No, because I like to know who's in the room before I insult them. The University of Iowa has something like this as well. Theirs is not particularly helpful. It says things like, generate a list of actions required to address the root cause and prevent problems from getting to others. Assign an owner and timeline to each action. Status actions to ensure completion. I mean, what is that? That's word soup. That's not even English. Implement action to address the root cause. Verify actions are complete. How? How am I going to do this? And how am I going to verify if they're complete? So there are other solutions out there, not just mine. Ooh, agile. We're going to skip that bit. What this comes down to is having a bunch of processes to solve problems and having a knowledge base which will give you the details and the instructions to help you fulfill a particular task, get through a process, or solve a particular problem. Who's got a knowledge base with their employer or where they work? Me. 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5. Sometimes you will find that if you talk to people in a big organisation, particularly the managers, you ask them to do surveys and they will come up with different answers to the same question. Interesting research from donkeys years ago, but it's a little bit like having a football team where half the players know what the game of football is all about and the other half are not too sure what they're doing there. You get managers who don't know what their role is in an organisation. How are they going to help their staff fulfil their role? A knowledge base is the thing that helps you solve these problems. Who are these people? René Descartes. Break everything down into smaller tasks. Break all of your small tasks down into really small, trivial subtasks, and keep doing that until you can trick your brain into getting started on one of them. Einstein, make everything as simple as possible, and no simpler than that. Peter Drucker, the classic model of the firm. One of the great quotes I like from Peter Drucker is, implementation is everything. Does anyone recognize the next one? Peter Checkland, Systems Thinking, Systems Design, classic book from 1999. Checkland is very much into modeling the process. And I like the idea of processes are important, and if you know what the process is, you can get the task done. Stephen Covey, what's he famous for? Seven Habits. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. In the 7 Habits, one bit that really stands out and gets quoted a lot is the time management matrix. Stephen Covey's time management matrix, which he nicked off a Second World War soldier. I think he was called General Dwight Eisenhower. But Stephen Covey gets all of the good press for the time management matrix, and it's a Dwight Eisenhower management strategy, which is amazing. It basically says, is this a crisis? Does it need my attention now? Is this something that's really important, preparation that I've got to do in order to prevent something becoming a crisis in the future? Is this relatively routine and mundane? Could I delegate it to somebody else? Is this trivia, which I should save for doing an entertaining session at a BarCamp? So he has 4 categories of what's important and where you should apply your time. Clearly, apply your time to anything that's a crisis. Spend most of your time dealing with important tasks which might lead to a crisis, but by doing the backup this week, you won't have the crisis next week when the hard disk fails. He also says, is it important to me that I do this? Or is it important to somebody else that somebody does it? You don't have to do everything normally in a big organization. Finally, De Bono. I read a lot. I've read De Bono's stuff, and I've been fortunate. I have met De Bono on 2 occasions, and he has this theory of blocked by openness. We shouldn't be blocked by openness. We should use our creative brain as much as we can. If you're trying to think of a solution to a problem, don't stop at the first one. Think of 10 solutions, because there's quite a possible chance that idea number 5 is so much better than idea number 1 that you came up with. So let's look at knowledge bases. Is the knowledge base in the right place, offering the right solution to the right people at the right time? And if I consider the world of medicine, if you have a headache, well, the knowledge base is in your head. You know, you take 2 aspirin, have a drink of water, have a rest. If it's something a bit more complex, you might go, theoretically, you might go and consult a GP. And if something a GP has not seen before, she might look it up in her reference material. If it's particularly serious, you might go and see a consultant. And any consultant, particularly consultant surgeon, will look up his specialist material before doing any operation. So knowledge bases exist either in your head, on the iPad of the GP, on the big knowledge base belonging to the NHS. But what I really want to know is not how to do operations, I want to know how to party. A friend of mine was the manager at HSBC Bank in Folkestone, and he tells me the story of Sally. Sally had been employed to cover maternity leave, and after the 9-month employment as a temp, Sally was leaving. And then the staff were asking, do we do leaving dues for temps? And some wag piped up with, oh, there'll be a process for that on the knowledge base, because HSBC has this massive, extensive knowledge base which tells you how to do everything. They have a process for absolutely everything. So back to the little old lady who lives in Kent. She has masses and masses of paper on her desk, and she needs a solution. The easy solution is buy a shredder, jam the shredder up against the letterbox of your front door, and any paper that comes through the front door immediately gets shredded. Not quite the optimal solution, but it does the job. Albert Einstein, me paraphrasing him. The brain is a marvellous calculating machine. That capacity for intellectual thought should be put to full use, and the brain should not be used for storing information. That's what pen and paper are for. And I got that from Isaacson's book when he said, he called us to our pens, to our paper, to draw, to write, to bring our thoughts out of our mind and into the world. A good example of a knowledge base. GitLab. GitLab tells you how to do all the things that you might ever want to do on GitLab. It says in the documentation, which is this slide, plan and track the work, build your application, deploy and release your application. And they have a handbook, and the handbook is for the staff, for the organization. It talks about GitLab's vision, strategy, culture, hiring, interviewing, onboarding, spending company money, travel, visas. And what's remarkable about the GitLab handbook and the GitLab documentation, it's available to everybody. In most organizations, something like that handbook would be locked down and access controlled. But if you want to see how GitLab does recruitment, interviews, onboarding, it's available on the web. It's all public. That is my idea of a perfect knowledge base, the GitLab handbook. This is the knowledge base belonging to the little old lady who lives in Kent. Well, it started off like this, a blank sheet of paper. And that's the one which I was guiding her towards. Now, I did that consultancy in 2004, very much focused on paper management. I had a process written in my own knowledge base, or operations manual. In the old days, we used to call these things operations manual. Anybody worked in McDonald's? No, I haven't either. But I had a girlfriend who worked in McDonald's, and she explained that they have an operations manual. It details every single process that a typical McDonald's outlet has. So imagine pre-internet days, how many processes in a typical McDonald's? They're in the operations manual. And it was paper, in ring binders, lever arch files. If you stack the lever arch files up on the floor, they would reach your waist. That's how many processes a single McDonald's outlet has. And it was all documented. So that if you need to know how to prepare a burger, how to serve fries, how to clean a syrup tank, it's all there in the operations manual. But I like the GitLab one, and I quite like mine, but mine is all about questions and answers, which someone should tell the guy who came from Iowa University, because theirs was just do this, do this, do this. No questions. The thing is, with a problem-solving technique, my solution might not be ideal for everybody, because you can't solve other people's problems unless you know what their context is. So you can only deliver the right solution to the right person in the right context. This is a general approach, and I'm going to skip the paper management one, which is somewhere in the middle. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we start with defining and working out what to do with the problem. And then if your knowledge base does not have the process, what are we going to do about developing a process, adding it to the knowledge base, and having a solution which we can implement in future? The first flowchart out of the 10 is the pioneer. Now, I'm not expecting you to read that. And Stephen Covey will tell you, one of the chapters in his book is begin with the end in mind. So what is on the end of this pioneer flowchart? What are we starting with? We're starting with put it in the trash. End of story. We are going to sunset everything, whether it's a project, an object, paper, a lifestyle. Eventually, everything will come to an end and it stops. So once we know that we're beginning with that end in mind, we can then work out, well, where are we starting? Oh, I should add, there is one other possibility. You don't put everything in the trash. Sometimes you pass it on to the descendants. That photograph. There you go. There's your legacy. So there is a different end possible. There is an alternative end. The start. Where do we start? Does this thing really need evaluating? What is the worst possible thing that could happen if I just bin this now? Then you ask yourself, can I live with that? The worst possible consequence. Can I live with it? If I can live with that, bin it. You don't have a problem. You don't have a process to build. You don't have to do anything else. Bill Gates is a big fan of having a knowledge base. Like a human being, a company has to have internal communication mechanism, a nervous system to coordinate its actions. And Tim Ferriss, a GTD sort of guy, says the art of getting things done is to let 10 bad little things happen every week. So sometimes I get an email and I go, not important, bin it. Sometimes I get an email from a supplier and I'm going, this is just marketing, bin it. Sometimes I get a tedious email from a tedious contact who thinks that I've got more hours in the day than I really have, bin it. It's not important. The paper management one I need to rush through, but come on to the final one, the solutioneer. If I do not have a process in my knowledge base, how am I going to develop a process? Now, the thing is with business coaches and management science is everything we say has been said before. I have borrowed an awful lot of material from the people that I showed you earlier. But if you go back in time, all management science basically came from military strategy. And it starts in 1650 with John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Then you get to about 1769. You get Arthur Wellesley, better known as the Duke of Wellington. These people were the ones who sort of worked out, here's a strategy, here's a process that needs fulfilling, here's the way we're going to do that process. And finally, you get to the late 1800s, where industrialists and businessmen were thinking, you know, we can borrow a lot of ideas from the successful military people in the past. Interestingly, Peter Drucker. No, Peter Checkland. Peter Checkland likes Gantt charts. Anybody use a Gantt chart? Gantt charts? What about the harmonogram? Karol Adamicki designed the harmonogram in 1896. He was a Polish engineer. And because he was an engineer and he was Polish, he published a little report in Polish which Henry Gantt got a hold of a few years later. And Henry Gantt was a professor or a lecturer at Harvard University at the time. And 20 years later, after Karol Adamicki published his Polish report on the harmonogram, Henry Gantt prepares an English version and calls it the Gantt chart. So, Henry Gantt, the Gantt chart, nicked from 20 years earlier from a Polish engineer who was not a university lecturer, who didn't publish in English, who didn't have the sort of audience that the Harvard professor Henry Gantt had. 1916 it was published, 20 years after Adamicki published it in 1896. The reason I'm telling you this is that a lot of the stuff that I've told you so far is not my material. There's a little bit in this final solution chart, which is my own original proactive pull idea. So, where do we start? If the solution is not documented in our knowledge base, and we've got to come up with a new one, let's think about similar things that we've seen before. This sort of challenge or a similar challenge. Have we seen it in a prior job? Have we seen it in our private life? Was there something like this discussed at school? Seen it on TV, in a book, newspaper, on the radio? Just write some rough notes about whatever it is that you've come across that resembles deployment. My mum loves me. Interrupting my session, but never mind. Yes, so have we seen this sort of thing before? And if we haven't, we're a bit stuck. So if we haven't, think about the best boss that you ever worked for. Think about the best teacher that you ever had at school. Ignoring the issue is not allowed. So what I want you to do is think about these personal luminaries in your life, that boss, that teacher, that person in your life who has been good at addressing problems, coming up with solutions. And then write down what you think Mr. Black, my physics teacher, would have done about it. Or Mr. Gardner, who was an incredibly good geography teacher. These people made a big impact on me, and I still have ideas, and I'm going, what would Mr. Black do about this? And it's a great way to just come up with some really scribbly notes which form the initial part of the process that I'm trying to build. And then, the way Covey says it, start with the end in mind. So with my process, I'm going, when this task or process or service ends, what are the expected outcomes or outputs? Write them down. And now that I know where I'm going, what needs to be brought together in order to implement that outcome at the end? Write down a list of all the component parts, the prerequisites. And once you know what you need at the end, where you're starting, the middle, how are you going to combine all of those components, process them, combine them, separate them, filter them, refine them, whatever. Divide that, René Descartes style, into as many subtasks as possible and work out the order they go into and how you're going to combine them. And what sort of quality control process are you going to need in order to actually fulfill that process? So put it all together, consolidate it, proofread it, ask somebody else to proofread it for you, and when you feel that you've got a solution, add it to your knowledge base, congratulate yourself, go off and implement it. So, as I said, my job is to help businesses, but more importantly, my job is to make people happy. Who else do you know who needs to hear about building their own knowledge base, their own processes, and coming up with a universal problem-solving technique which suits them, rather than trying to pick the one from Iowa University or pick the one from Proactive Paul? Thoughts or questions? Stone silence, the man is bonkers. Yes?
Do you do any kind of note-taking things for yourself?
Good old school note-taking.
Like, I use a tool called Obsidian.
You can tell from the absence of hair on my head that I'm a bit old school. And although I do like getting phone calls on my iPhone to interrupt my presentations, I walk around, he says, with a journal in my jacket pocket, which was in my jacket pocket, and which is now in my bag. Pen and paper. Yeah, I'm old school. I mean, I started work before the internet was even invented. Before computers were commonplace in offices, we did everything with paper. I suddenly became the geek because I was the one who knew how to use a spreadsheet, and I thought they were wonderful. So paper. But yes, you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.